speakers, and what we were thinking was give them 10 minutes each to put across their points, and then we'll open it up to the floor. That's okay. I'm Janet Cassidy, I'm the chair of Clydebank Trade Council. On my right is Susan Galloway, who is, I've got it down here as a feminist activist. To my left, what do you think? Right, left. Is Leila Hill, who's an NUJ member, and she's also on the Scottish TUC General Council. And John Brennan, Clydebank Women Supporting Women. So, can I start off with you, John? If that's okay? Yep.
Like the way Stella said, I was far left. And I'm afraid I forgot my speech, so I'm going to have to use my phone, so I'm getting down with the young team tonight, so now it's going to no. So thank you very much for inviting Clydebank Women Supporting Women along. Clydebank Women Supporting Women was created when Clydebank Women's Aid was closed in July to try and campaign for not only the return of domestic abuse services in Clydebank but also other services, violence against women's services, because there was never enough anyway. So for a long time now we've had the crumbs and now we want the cake. So that's where we are. But we're really excited to be here because this conversation is required for a number of reasons. Not least of all, violence against women and girls is at epidemic levels in Scotland. In 2022 to 23, nearly 2,000 online child sexual abuse offences were recorded by Police Scotland, and it's one of the fastest growing concerns identified by frontline officers. In 23 to 24, there were over 63,800 domestic abuse incidents reported to Police Scotland, and this year alone we are seeing an increase of more than 300% in rape and sexual assault reports in areas in Scotland. Yet the very services that women and children rely on to escape and recover from violence are more under threat now than any point in their 60-year history. Add a criminal justice system that routinely fails survivors, and the warning signs could not be clearer. Unless we act now, things are going to get worse. To meet this crisis, we need honest, evidence-based conversations about what women and children truly need to be safe. If we don't, we risk losing essential services, giving perpetrators confidence that they can offend with impunity. And as we're here to discuss tonight, leaving space for the far right to exploit fear and redirect it towards black minority ethnic communities. Last year, Scotland recorded 6,227 hate crimes. Hate does not simply harm individuals, it intimidates whole communities. And when hate rises, women and girls in those communities face two forms of danger: continued gender-based violence and racialised scapegoating. The far right's rhetorical playbook is predictable and it is poisonous. It works like this: take a legitimate concern, child sexual exploitation, grooming or women's safety, strip away the nuance and evidence, amplify the most sensational cases, and point the finger at immigrants, Muslims and racialised minorities. And that finger then becomes a wedge, dividing communities, spreading fear and distracting from the real drivers of abuse: misogyny, under-resourced protective services, digital platforms that enable exploitation, and institutions that fail to hold perpetrators to account. Investigations and watchdog reports have repeatedly shown how the far-right groups publicly claim to support survivors while using those interactions to spread anti-Muslim myths and mainstream xenophobia. They groom public opinion, not to protect women and children, but to radicalise people and normalise racism. They put on the costume of victim advocacy to win legitimacy, then use that legitimacy to shift the conversation from prevention to exclusion, and this does not help women and children, as we know. But Scotland cannot have an honest conversation about safety without acknowledging our own history of institutional abuse. The Scottish Child Abuse Inquiry has exposed decades of systematic failure across children's homes, residential schools, religious orders and state-run institutions. Survivors have testified to physical, sexual and emotional abuse, not as isolated incidents, but as patterns enabled by unchecked power, weak oversight and institutions that protected themselves rather than the children they were there to save. These are feminist lessons that we've been forced to relearn. Abuse flourishes where inequality exists, where women and children's voices are dismissed and where institutions are not held accountable. One of the most disturbing examples is Carelaw School. Investigations have uncovered persistent physical and sexual abuse, staff misconduct ignored for years, and management failures to act on clear warnings. Many survivors were girls and young vulnerable women, left unprotected in a system that was meant to safeguard them. The history exposes a truth that the right deliberately avoids. Abuse is not something imported into Scotland. Much of it is being perpetrated within our own institutions, overwhelmingly by white Scottish men in a position of trust. Violence against women is not an occasional act of a few bad individuals. It is rooted in a patriarchal society that enables some men to abuse with impunity. We see this as not only in the statistics I mentioned earlier, but also in the fact that in 2025 we are still debating whether prostitution, where women are overwhelmingly harmed, should count as exploitation. Scotland's anti-trafficking organisation has estimated that Scottish men spend around £22.5 million a year buying sex from trafficked women, many of whom can't even speak English. That is not a marginal issue, it is a national disgrace. And into this complex reality, the far right inserts a dangerous lie that sexual exploitation is foreign, that grooming gangs are a product of immigration, and that protecting women requires hostility towards minority communities. This narrative is emotionally manipulative, politically convenient, and factually wrong. It erases decades of institutional abuse uncovered by the Child Abuse Inquiry, the failures of our own systems like care law, the complex realities of group-based exploitation, and the fact that the vast majority of violence against women and children in Scotland is perpetrated from men from the majority population. And it harms us in three ways. It misdirects policy, it focuses on race instead of risk factors, institutional failures and prevention. It silences survivors. Survivors from minority communities in particular are treated with suspicion. Survivors from institutional abuse are ignored because they don't fit the narrative. It fuels racism and hate crime, and when hate arises, women and girls are targeted, and targeted communities face increased threats to their freedom and safety. To truly protect women and girls, Scotland must back the services that have always led the way. Feminist, survivor-centred, independent organisations such as Clydebank Women's Aid, who we lost in July. These are the very services now fighting for survival, often because they've stayed true to their principles: single-sex spaces for women escaping male violence, collective working, and an unflinching analysis of patriarchy. Violence against women and children is rooted in patriarchy, and patriarchy is a key component of the right-wing movement and fascism. The right-wing movement therefore promotes the very systems it is claiming to challenge. Today, as in the 1980s, women's organisations are being forced to choose to deliver the services that save lives or dilute their mission to align with systems that repeatedly fail women and children. The violence against women sector was born in reaction to systems that not only failed to protect women and children, but also promoted traditional, male-dominated hierarchical systems and services where the perpetrator was invisible and therefore the women left with the responsibility. We need to stand beside these services, not replace their expertise with political convenience. So what can we do? Support and amplify survivor-led organisations, especially those under pressure. It is essential that single-sex women's spaces are protected. To quote Mark Sawotka, if the left stays quiet when a meeting of around 2,500 women in Brighton campaigning against male violence and misogyny is violently attacked, it should hang its head in shame. But more than this, it abandons the women and young people who are affected by violence against women and children, who the right will gleefully pick up under the guise of compassion and protection. We need to challenge misinformation online, in the media and in our own circles. We cannot enter into the incel discussions that encourage misogyny and abuse denial, and it might sound obvious, but the evidence is there that some of those that should be standing beside us are standing against us. We need to push for better safeguarding in schools, youth organisations and local services, and stand publicly with targeted communities when hate crime arises. But we also need to vote for leaders that can act on evidence and not in fear, and it is a real struggle to see who those people are. We need people who can provide leadership and analysis that is not fearful of the next tweet or post that distracts us from pursuing safety for all women and children. Violence against women and girls is a structural problem, and only collective, feminist, evidence-based action will address it. The far right offers division and distraction. We offer solidarity, truth and prevention. Women's safety is not a tool for racism, it's a human right and it belongs to us all, and we all have a responsibility to pursue it. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Dawn. Layla?
Yeah, sometimes it's kind of intimidating, you don't know whether to go first, last, or in between.
I was on first, I could forget.
So, thank you. You set the tone really nicely. Thank you everyone for being here tonight. I appreciate it's a Monday night and it's quite cold. I was just going to touch a little bit upon like the media. I'm with the National Union of Journalists. I know that some of the stuff that is reported by some of my colleagues and comrades isn't great, but just to say that there is work being done and there is work that members of the public can do as well. And I think just to echo what Dawn said, violence against women isn't something that's new. I mean, we all know that. It's been happening for centuries. It's always about race, it's always about gender, and it's always about class. When women are killed or harmed by men, even in this day and age in the media, it's portrayed as a one-off, in a fit of rage or lust. And whilst individual men should always be held responsible for the actions that they've taken, the murder of women is systemic, and it's rooted in women's unequal status in society, and that status reflects the unbalanced distribution of social, political and economic power amongst women and men in society. And I think also what we have to remember is that the media has very rarely served the interests of the working classes, and this includes, you know, what's considered more liberal forms of media like The Guardian. I think they're often quoted as being like a good example of good media, but sometimes it's also in what's not said in the media, much more than what is said or what isn't said. I think we have to remember in times of the British Empire, the media worked to depict people who looked like me and people who were from other parts of the world as inhuman, to justify them being sold as bits of property. And this has never gone away. The dehumanisation of people continues on in today's media. Look at the ways in which folks in Palestine have been referred to, if at all, disabled people, and trans people, refugees whose full stories are never told. And I think this is the issue, our full stories are never told. It's a very flattened perspective. Refugees come here because they want a better life, and yes, that's true, but we always have to remember there was the British Empire, there was imperialism, there was colonisation, and not to forget the impact that continues to have, extractivism, and what we're seeing, the impact on climate crisis and the inability for people to grow things and live in ways in which they used to, which was within our means. Full stories are never told, and we've also seen that with inquiries into the Hillsborough disaster, the post office scandal, Grenfell, Stephen Lawrence, the Battle of Orgreaves, spy cops, and even in the death of Sheikh Bayo. In each of these inquiries, which, I mean, I have thoughts about public inquiries, but what we do learn about, or through them, is that we learn about police brutality, we learn about cover-ups, we learn about surveillance, we learn about abuse, threats, and we learn about false media reporting. We also learn about the true violent face of the state, who is cozying up to the far right. We also become more conscious of the fact that we do live in a society which is very superficial and which is full of spectacle as well. The far right like to use something that's called freedom of speech, which I'm sure you've all heard, and that defender role is a card that they like to play. But as the far right narratives have not only entered into the mainstream and have become the mainstream narrative, surely this is disingenuous, because they have complete freedom of speech and they have complete control of the media at the moment. Terms like cancel culture and politically correct are being used as cliches, and they're applied to everything and nothing, and they're actually devoid of any real meaning. And again, if we look at the example, the ways in which pro-Palestinian voices are being silenced globally, from New York to Berlin to Glasgow, these cases represent a literal example of cancel culture as a way of shutting down opinions that are not agreed with in the mainstream media or political discourse. So beyond the catchy headlines and the cheap outrage, where are the right wing being silenced, and where the far right voices not being heard? A few weeks ago, I sometimes quite like to put on daytime TV if I'm working from home, see what's happening, and there was a sudden break in the TV programme and they switched to the BBC. It was the BBC, and they switched to the news. And it was on for an hour, just Nigel Farage talking. And I thought maybe it's a policy announcement, maybe it's a political party announcement. It was nothing. They were just broadcasting him talking for an hour. Then it went on to Loose Women, who were talking about, well, get all the refugees out. So again, it's like, audiences are targeted and they know how to speak to people that are at home, maybe not connected like with their communities. And some media are helping certain views gain acceptability, and this isn't something that's unique to the UK. We've seen in Hungary, Orban has amassed control of the Hungarian media. Maloney has been taking control of the Italian broadcaster in a way that hasn't been seen since Silvio Berlusconi's time, and censoring any sort of voices that are not aligned with the narrative. GB News in the UK is probably the most known for providing a platform to some of the most extreme voices. Whilst obviously with social media, with no regulations, no controls, everything just becomes fact. And even if it is debunked or demythed, it doesn't matter because it's just forgotten about pretty quickly. So the cancel culture, which is denounced by the right and the far right, I would say is fictional. It doesn't exist. It comes to them. And on the other hand, their political designs for those who do not subscribe to their political visions are real. And it is becoming more and more complex and difficult to distinguish the differences between the right and the far right, just because basic principles in terms of rights and personal freedoms, particularly for minorities, particularly for marginalised people, are seen to be stepped on. So whilst the Labour Party are not part of the far right galaxy, as such, another important element of recent years is that the fact of the divide between the right and the far right in terms of narratives and policies have become very, very blurry. I think the inability to distinguish between Keir Starmer's Island of Strangers, compared to something that would perhaps be said by Nigel Farage, is a very testing time that we're in. Some of the stuff that Suella Braverman was saying back in her reign is no different to what the current Home Secretary is saying. And arguably some of the narratives which are also coming from the SNP are very similar but just coded in a slightly different way, so I think we just have to be aware of that. So the mainstream media has a huge responsibility for the normalisation of such narratives and characters, and I think it should be obvious to anyone that's concerned about these politics and the threat that they pose to democracy in certain communities, that humanising these people and not holding them to account, particularly through like fun reality TV shows or coverage of their hobbies other than their politics, only seeks to normalise that. They're the ones who are committing acts which are inhumane. Why don't we read about or know about the fact that since 2012 life expectancy in the UK has stalled and it's worse for the least well off? Why don't we talk about or see in the media that over 300,000 excess deaths have happened in the UK between 2012 and 2019, and that's a knock-on impact of austerity policies? Life expectancy, which is something that only ever declines during times of crisis, like World War I, World War II, is indicative of the overall health and wealth of a society. And it's pretty telling that this is not a well society. In Scotland, amongst the 20 most deprived population, the rates of premature deaths have increased by 6 to 7%. Yet we don't hear about that, and we're not talking about it. We don't hear about services being closed down, and that services are trying to survive upon years and decades of austerity measures. And it is always women on low incomes, and it's women from minority ethnic backgrounds, it's disabled women, and it's families with children who are amongst those who are the hardest hit. So this leaves us with the need to reckon with the crucial role that the mainstream media plays in mainstreaming like these types of narratives, that they serve elites. They serve elites with privileged access to shaping public discourse through media, through politics and through academia, and who aren't sitting wondering how they're going to pay for their next meal, how they're going to be able to get their children to school, how they're going to be able to heat their homes. So there is a duty for us to call out narratives that we see in the media. We can do that by reporting things to IPSO, we can report things to Impress, and I think also like having a bit more media literacy. Media, like most industries as well, have also suffered. The majority of media is owned by billionaires, millionaires, and it doesn't serve their interests to report stories of connectivity, stories of community, stories of resistance, the fact that people do fight back, and we have fought back, and we will continue to fight back. We need to be putting in more freedom of information requests to public bodies, to councils, to governments, and asking and holding them to account, because it is public services, asking why it's closing down, where's the money going instead, and working more closely together and not sharing our resources as much as we can. But I'm not sure if I'm still under 10 minutes or over 2 minutes.
No, okay.
I'm all right. Well, I'm just going to wrap up there.
Thank you. I'm speaking really just from making a contribution from just a personal point of view, and I wanted to address specifically the issue of child sexual exploitation. What the media like to term grooming gangs. I worked for many years for a children's charity, and have spent a number of years working very intensively on issues around child sexual abuse, and particularly looking at the response that children get after disclosure, and the services, the therapeutic services that are available to them, or rather are not available to them, looking at the West of Scotland area. And so I do feel very strongly about the way that the horrific experiences and the suffering of victim survivors of child sexual exploitation are being weaponised by the far right at the moment. It just adds another layer upon layer of insult to those young women. Particularly the fact that their experiences are being politically hijacked by a far right who have contempt for women and contempt for women's rights. And it's really depressing, I find it really depressing to see how this whole issue is being used as a political football at the moment, and the way that the Labour government in particular is just conceding ground to a far right agenda, an agenda that's been set by reform. And they're having to do that because they have been found out in their failure to take any action at all in terms of addressing, providing justice for those victims. They failed to take any action to implement the recommendations that came out of that 7-year-long independent inquiry into child sexual abuse in England. They've dragged their heels. Even now, they have, they've only agreed to implement, fewer than half of the recommendations to protect children. So, it is of course a racist myth that black men pose a threat to white women. Is a racist myth that has very long historical roots. And in the here and now, it's a deliberate distortion of the facts about one form of child sexual abuse, that the group-based sexual exploitation of girls. And as Dawn has said, they're stripped away and ignoring everything that doesn't fit in with their racist narrative. And the way that those racist narratives are being mainstreamed into the media and repeated by media organisations is deeply depressing. I mean, even the term grooming gangs that is used is never used about white perpetrators, and as Dawn says, it's the majority population who are responsible for the majority of these crimes. And it is kind of ironic that over the course of this year, there's been the whole issue around Prince Andrew and his close friendship with Jeffrey Epstein, a convicted sex offender, has been in the news continuously. And we're talking about a man who has been convicted of grooming, trafficking and sexually exploiting young girls for wealthy men. I mean, he's a wealthy financier himself, Epstein, trafficking young girls to be exploited by some of the wealthiest men in the world, wealthy politicians, celebrities and so on. Hopefully we will get to know some of their names when these files are published. But the term grooming gangs, have you ever heard it being used in reference to these people? No, of course not. So the hijacking of this issue has been about making the whole discussion about the abuses on their ethnicity and about the question of race, when first and foremost this has always been a question of male violence against women and girls. And it's a further layer of insult even now that the victim survivors of these crimes are not even at the centre of the discussion. It's all about the men and their ethnicity. But the second thing about this is that it's about the failure of the state and all the services whose job it is to protect girls and boys as well over decades right up to the present, and the cover-up that's taken place, the systematic cover-ups to protect institutions and organisations. And it's also a class issue because the children concerned in these abuses have predominantly been working class children, children in the care system, children growing up on the edge of care, and very young children. The average age of girls who've been sexually exploited in these by gangs is between 10 years and 15 years. So we're talking about some primary age girls being brutally exploited by adult men. And one other thing that's often overlooked is that disproportionately amongst the group of children who've been exploited are lots of girls who have learning disabilities, neurodivergent children and physically disabled children, a disproportionate number. And of course disabled children are around 6 times more likely to be sexually abused than non-disabled children. The response that these girls received from services was marked by class prejudice and misogyny. And it's because of that response and the degree of failure in the response that the far right is able to pose to working class communities as standing up for working class children against the establishment, because it's the establishment that has failed and has covered up these crimes over the years. So my point, the main point that I wanted to make tonight is, yes, we do need to have an effective response to the far right and the way that it's manipulating these issues and hijacking the whole question of sexual abuse and exploitation. But we also need to have an effective response to the issue that they're hijacking. We cannot ignore that. We need to have an effective response to sexual abuse and sexual exploitation, because these are not small issues. There is an epidemic of sexual exploitation of girls at the moment. These are a rising level of crimes that are happening. It's not a small problem, it's a large problem. 15% of girls will have been sexually abused by the time they're 16 years of age in Scotland. Of all the sexual crimes that are recorded by the police, 37% are committed against children in Scotland. 19% of the population are under 18. 37% of all sexual crimes are committed against them. And too often, the investigations and inquiries that have taken place over the years, and there have been scores and scores of them up and down the whole of the UK, have been excuses for doing nothing about the problem. As I said, we've just had a 7-year-long inquiry into child sexual abuse in England and Wales, which cost over £180 million. It had 20 recommendations, which first the Tory government and now the Labour government have dragged their heels about implementing. We've got an ongoing national inquiry into child abuse in Scotland, which has been going on for 7 years and is continuing. So far, £85 million has been spent on that. And yet we're now getting calls for yet another national inquiry into grooming gangs. You know, what we need is for some action to be happening now, for people to be taking responsibility. So, what the far right are editing out of the picture, which they don't want us to focus on when they're presenting these as crimes committed by black men against white girls, is the fact that girls from minoritized communities are also targets for sexual exploitation within their communities. Alexis Jay, who led the inquiry into sexual exploitation by gangs in Rotherham, said it was quite inconceivable that the very dangerous men who had committed these crimes against children were not also committing abuse and crimes against children within their own families and communities. But you know, these kinds of crimes that are happening within these communities are the children are silenced and coerced, but using very specific cultural in very specific cultural ways. And one of the problems with our services and how they respond is that they lack that cultural understanding to be able to keep girls in black and minoritized communities safe and to be able to respond to them. I'll try and sum up. I'm probably going on a bit long, but I think there are three things that are happening at the moment. The first is a rise in violence against women, the normalisation of misogyny, the rise in racism and racist violence, and we should never forget that racist violence is also gendered. So black and minority women and girls are especially targeted for racist aggression. Misogyny and anti-immigrant hatred combine together in really toxic ways. And as white people, because we're mostly all white people in this room, we need to be alert to the impact that the rise of racism is having on our black colleagues, neighbours, you know, people in our communities, because we're often blind to the impact that it's having on people. We need to be taking that really seriously. The other thing that I think I wanted to raise is not just the rise in misogyny and violence against women and racism, but also the mainstreaming of anti-working class prejudice, particularly in the wake of Brexit. And that anti-working class prejudice, I think, is also gendered. It's very normalised to treat working class teenage girls with derision, and that's been part of the problem with the response to sexual exploitation. So I just want to end with, you know, how do we counter the far right narrative, but how do we also really protect our children from the actual abuse that's happening, and not just the fabricated threats that the far right is trying to stir up in communities. The first thing is that the main risks to children are from those closest to them, including from their own peers. And one of the things that we need to be taking action on is the fact that most online sexual offences and online grooming and sexual exploitation of girls is being carried out on online platforms, and it's actually between children, it's peer-to-peer, and it's by older boys and young men on younger females. The other thing is that, you know, we need to think about is there is a call for the race and ethnicity of perpetrators to be recorded. That's one of the things the Labour government has been asked to act on coming out of the Casey review. Is that something that we should support? Are there racist motivations behind that call? Personally, I think that we need as much information as possible about perpetrators, the connections between them, how they associate, the basis for that, the context in which they're operating, their attitudes, what the things that facilitate or inhibit their behaviour. And I think the ethnicity of perpetrators and also of victims is relevant, because the priority should be having all the information that we need to be able to disrupt, to deter and prevent these crimes from happening in the first place. And there's been far too little research that will help us with that kind of prevention work. And the final thing I'll just mention is that in terms of prevention, the cuts to services have made it more difficult to protect children, as Dawn has said. Things like cuts to after-school activities, the removal of youth services, the withdrawal of funding from community organisations, all the things that you need to provide a safety net for children, particularly children that are suffering neglect. That all of these things, the impact of austerity has had a really terrible effect on our ability to protect children. Yes, I've got a few other things, but I think I've taken up enough time, and it's thanks, John.
I must say, you've certainly given us plenty to think about, and I don't know if you're aware that Clydebank have lost their women's refuge, which, I wondered where they would all go, but hopefully everything's they're all taken care of. No. Alright, that's a definite. They don't. And if you
just very briefly, I think you've all just summed up with the contributions you've just made. The subject of this was about how we combat far right and what they're doing at the moment to stir up, anti-immigrant racists feeling in communities. I think we do need to think carefully about how we respond to that, because I think there is a real danger that we maybe play into their agenda. We need to be looking at ways to de-escalate, and the situation around the primary school in Kilmarnock that somebody raised, we need to be careful that we're looking at ways to de-escalate rather than ramping up and playing into their hands, which is what they want. So we need to combat their agenda, but and the way that we do that is that we have to put forward a real socialist alternative. That's the real solution. We need to be out campaigning, putting the socialist arguments to people, what our real solutions are to the problems that people are facing at the moment. There has to be a positive message and not just an anti-message. And I think that the role that the Clydebank Trades Council are playing, going out, you have to be out there talking to people to make a difference. You need to be bringing people together as you do regularly with these public meetings. It's making the connections between activists on different issues, that's building that kind of unity and solidarity, and rebuilding a working class movement is the way that we're going to win this.
I feel like everybody's summed up in their questions as well. I think what we've recognised is the old ways and the new ways, or the old new ways and everything just aren't working, and it hasn't been working for people for a long, long time. Business as usual isn't working. I think it's we also have to name and recognise that alienation, has been a big part of this, and it's an ongoing process, and it's designed to make us not want to be in a room with each other and not to find out who's living behind that door, or just care about people. And it is building trust like with each other again, and being prepared to make a stand for somebody that you don't know about. I hear what Robert's saying, like I live in a different part of Glasgow, like where I think folks are being unnecessarily tarred with being fascist, to intentionally stop that conversation from going further and just say, well, we don't want to engage with them and we're creating our own sense of community, which excludes working class folks. So I think everything, just what we're saying, comes back down to class. I think also we need to be working from a place of possibility, like you were saying. We need to be working from a place of creativity and adaptation, of risk and of hope and of healing. A lot of people are very, very hurt and damaged by what society has created. We need to be wondering like how we can share what we have, because even though we might not think that we have a lot, we do. And if that is even just inviting somebody in for a cup of tea and having a conversation with them, but it's just creating opportunities to find out more of what we have in common than what we don't have, or than what we don't have in common. Yeah, creating the spaces to make sure that we find out what we have in common, and talking back to like that value set. It's just like that people do care. Like we aren't like the elite. We don't care. We don't want to see people dying on our doorstep. We don't want to hear 67 like women who have died in temporary accommodation. Like I think like that's the shape. Like we need to name that neglect. We need to name that shamefulness that we live in 2025, and that's something that's allowed and able to happen when there's a vast growth of billionaires, you know, making money that has like tons and tons of zeros. So I think it's just like we need to name like that sort of stuff. We need to build more community resilience. The old adage of educate, agitate, organise. That's what we need to go back and do. We need to educate people that this is intentional. All of these things are intentional. We need to agitate, we need to organise, build campaigns, teach people how to, like, you know, those skills that you have, so that you can go as a collective, that you can go en masse, because we can't do this individually. We need to politicise people, because that's what it is. They're being politicised in different ways. Like when there's high wages, when there's full employment, you don't see the far right. You don't hear like right-wing narratives. So it's just figuring out how we can work in what we have at the moment to build. Question people, ask them how does the world come to be this way, because it just doesn't happen overnight. I think we just have to be like judging and shaming and humiliating people isn't going to change things. Show alternatives, that there are alternatives, that there's always alternatives to this. And just understanding it's going to take work, and it's going to take collective work. What we're seeing now, I think, is just the start of something. I think it is going to get much, much harder, and we're going to have to just like really, really be there for each other. So it's long, it's dull, it's boring. You might not see the changes that you want to see in your lifetime, but you're doing it in the hope that you might see the changes further down the line. Yeah, I think that's it.
I'm a nightmare. I want to thank Cam and the Trades Council for doing this tonight. I've been dying to do a meeting like this for years. I think that violence against women is the indicator of where we are as a society. And someone recently said to me, well, what is living with fascism? Is living with fascism living with torture every day? Is living with fascism being financially controlled? Is living with fascism being threatened with murder every day? And that's what women have been living with for years. And the violence against women sector has been hugely, there's been a lot of strength around about it for 60 years now, and nobody has came to our rescue. And I think we have to be really, really careful here, because we talk about this 150,000, and Mark spoke about it at your party conference. 150,000 is nothing. It is nobody. And what's happening is people are travelling across the country to go to a rally that is clearly being led by Tommy Robinson. I'm sorry, that's unacceptable. If it walks like a duck and it quacks like a duck, then it's a duck. And we have to start calling that out, not because we want to abuse people, but because we want to be clear in who it is we're dealing with here and what behaviour in our society is acceptable or not. So what I would say is the violence against women sector has got lessons, practical lessons for everybody. We have been fighting this for 60 years, not me. 41. But we've been fighting this for 60 years, and here we're now at a point when we're not even allowed to speak anymore. And that is unacceptable. So I think we need to really think about what it is we're fighting here. And I think we need to be dead clear on it. Now, I am not for going out and shouting and bawling at people on the street, absolutely not. But I think calling out on what we're seeing is okay. And we've seen a significant shift over the months. We were doing stalls in the Clydebank shopping centre following the Clydebank Women's Aid closure. And at the start, I was shocked because when we first used to do it, people used to be dead abusive. And I remember one guy said, I was 15 or something, I was out collecting money for Women's Aid, and one guy came back for his money back because he thought it was for the dogs. Do you know what I mean? Didn't realise it was for women and children. That doesn't really exist anymore, and it was really heartening. The community was really behind the loss of the refuge. But as the months went on, we started to see a change, and we started to see people coming up and going, I bet you know where the money's going, hen. And that is about critical thinking. It's about people sitting watching the BBC, being filled with this information, and then some wee guy standing in the shopping centre who's going, what's so dead hard in it? Because he's got his own agenda to try and play on people's pain. Unacceptable, and McFarlane's of the world needs to get called out. It's a beautiful image of me on his website, because he's quick enough to abuse people, he's quick enough to put us up on websites to intimidate us. I said to him, go ahead, I was quite happy. But this is the situation we're in. So how do you fight that? And I think the points that have been made about what do you say to people when they're speaking to you like that? And I think it's numbers. I think it's standing together. It's not about that. If they say the numbers, they're not going to feel so smart as to actually say the statements. And I think that's really, really important. And the Trades Council do amazing. Every Monday they're out and they've been challenging the stalls where they can, and I think that's excellent. But I think we need to learn. We're here to talk about the right-wing hijacking of violence against women and children. This is unacceptable, and I'm going to put my hand up and say I'm part of that failure. Are the rest of us willing to do it? Do you know what I mean? Because what we've done, we took our eye off the ball. We let them get away with it. The bureaucratic mess that exists, we took our eye off the ball, and our expectations were so low because this year when the funding was cut and the call went out before the budget, and I went, oh, it's just another call because it's another budget problem. We're facing it on Friday, saying the budget's coming out tomorrow. We're finding out, the whole of the violence against women sector's finding out what their budgets are on Friday in Glasgow. That's unacceptable. But what did I do? I thought it'll be alright because they'll just get their money, and it's just one of those scare tactics again. They'll probably be kept at the same level because we are every year and always have been. We have taken our eye off the ball. And I don't think any of us should be surprised that the right wing's moving in this direction. It's always moved in this direction. It's these communities that stopped it from progressing, and somehow we've lost sight of that. We have to put our foot down and demand that this changes. And we can use systems like the EQIAs and things like that, but these have been used already. And I think Gillian's left, and I was wanting her to say, I said, did you say that on Monday? Because what she was talking about is how do we as communities stand together, and that's where we are. Women's Aid, rape crisis started with women taking women and children home to their homes. That's where we are. We are rapidly moving towards that again. We're looking at women taking young people in and doing gardening with them. We're looking at women and men supporting communities, men doing football groups with young people because there's no youth services. This is where we are. So yes, we have to keep demanding change in this bureaucratic nightmare that is part of this right-wing movement, but also as communities we need to stand together. And I am appealing. You are going to lose the feminists that are supporting these services because we are exhausted and we're on our knees. You need to start supporting the violence against women sector or you will lose it. And see all these problems we're talking about, housing, finance, violence in the community, illness, they are going to multiply over the next 10 years because at the core of it all is violence against women and children. It has to be stopped. We need you, we desperately need you, and we're going to need more over the next 5 to 10 years. But thank you so much for this event, because I think this is the start of a conversation, and the Morning Star event as well started that conversation about how does the violence against women sector get the respect it deserves, and also how can we support other communities to recognise what's actually going on here, because this is long term coming, and it's I'm being a failure to see what was actually coming ahead, and that's that. But I think that's okay to say though, George, do you know what I mean? So,
Chair, could have a brief
thank you very
moment?
much.
I must take it. When he was saying he felt a failure. You doing that part for him and the contributions I've made up to mine has been
Don't you even,
the real failure is not lying. And you're
Can I just
thanks and the other.
Can I just thank the panel and ask you to take some of the leaflets away with you? And safe journey home.